It was a scorching Saturday afternoon when the woman walked into the small retail store, her sneakers tapping lightly against the cool tile floor. The air was thick with the scent of fresh perfume and the low hum of fluorescent lights. The store was busy, as expected for a weekend, and shoppers moved quickly between aisles, making their way to the various sale racks scattered around the room. She slipped in quietly, hoping for a few minutes of peace, just a break from the whirlwind of her week. Dressed in simple jeans and a faded navy blue t-shirt, she blended in easily with the crowd. The casual look contrasted sharply with the sharp authority of her usual FBI attire: a suit, polished shoes, and a badge tucked carefully at her waist. Today, though, she was here for something ordinary: a quick stop to pick up some toiletries, a new set of shoes, and maybe a bottle of shampoo she'd been eyeing for weeks. Nothing too exciting, just an average Saturday for someone who lived a life filled with more than its fair share of excitement. She had spent the week running from one case to the next, tracking down leads, questioning suspects, and piecing together puzzles. Her work was never simple, never quiet, and certainly never predictable. But today, for just a few moments, she needed to put all of that aside. She was just another shopper. As she moved down the aisles, she began to notice something strange. People kept glancing at her, quick, furtive looks, as if she didn't belong. At first, she thought it was nothing. Maybe it was just the heat making her feel uncomfortable. But the feeling stayed with her. When she reached for a bottle on a shelf, she could feel eyes watching her, lingering for too long. The subtle stares weren't harsh, but there was something in them that made her stomach twist. Something that told her she wasn't seen as just another customer. She brushed the thought away. It wasn't the first time she'd been in a store and felt out of place, but today it felt different. Her instincts told her something wasn't quite right, even if she couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was. She continued down the aisle, trying to shake off the odd feeling. The shelves were stocked with everything she might need, but her mind wandered. Distracted by the sense that something was out of place, she approached the cosmetics section, where a young sales clerk was organizing the shelves, a clipboard in hand. The clerk looked up briefly, then went back to her task without a word. "Excuse me," the woman said, her voice calm but clear. "Can you help me find the right shade of foundation?" The clerk paused for a moment, glancing at her without meeting her eyes. There was a brief, uncomfortable silence before the young woman responded, her voice cool. "The shade chart is on the wall by the mirrors," she said, pointing vaguely in the direction of the back of the store. The woman nodded, trying to hide the flicker of confusion in her expression. The clerk didn't move, didn't offer to walk her over, or even acknowledge her need for assistance. Beyond the brief words, the woman hesitated, taking a step toward the mirrors, but the clerk's eyes seemed to linger on her, a faint judgment in them that made her skin crawl. She walked over to the wall, trying to focus on the task at hand. But as she scanned the various shades on display, she couldn't shake the feeling that the clerk's behavior was more than just indifference. It was as if she wasn't being seen as a person at all, but more like a problem or inconvenience. There was a subtle coldness in the air, an unspoken barrier between her and the other customers, who were being helped without question or hesitation. The woman let out a breath, trying to calm herself. She had dealt with far worse in her career, staring down dangerous criminals, facing life-or-death situations on a daily basis. Yet, this situation, though far from dangerous, felt like an uncomfortable challenge she wasn't quite prepared for. She took another deep breath and returned to the clerk. "I'm sorry. I think I need some advice on which product might work best for me. Could you take a look at my skin tone and recommend something?" The clerk barely glanced at her, before her gaze shifted over to the other side of the store, where a white woman was browsing. The clerk's expression changed immediately, a smile forming as she rushed over to assist the other customer. The woman stood there, staring at the interaction, her mouth dry. She knew she was being ignored. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach. Her hands clenched into fists by her sides. But she forced herself to stay calm. She was used to handling tough situations, to managing people who didn't always treat her with respect. But this felt different. It felt personal. She waited a few moments, watching the clerk help the other customer with enthusiasm, offering product suggestions and advice with a level of attention she hadn't been given. The contrast was stark. It was as if the clerk had forgotten she was standing there altogether. Feeling her frustration building, she glanced at the clerk again. The woman couldn't help but wonder if this treatment had anything to do with the way she looked, the way she carried herself. Would it have been the same if she had been white? Would the clerk have shown her the same respect? She took a step forward, resolved to say something. But before she could open her mouth, the clerk finally turned back to her with a practiced smile, clearly having realized that the woman wasn't leaving anytime soon. "What can I do for you?" she asked. But there was no warmth in her voice. The woman took a deep breath, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm going to need more than just a suggestion. I came here for help, not to be ignored." The clerk's eyes flashed briefly with something. Was it surprise? Discomfort? But the woman wasn't about to back down. She wasn't just going to walk away feeling like this. She opened her mouth to speak again, but then, in the corner of her eye, she noticed something. The badge tucked inside her purse. A small but powerful reminder of who she was, who she had worked so hard to become. For a split second, she thought about pulling it out, but no. She'd give the clerk a chance. She'd give this store a chance. The tension in the air thickened, and she couldn't shake the feeling that her patience was about to be tested in a way she hadn't anticipated. The woman stood there. For a few seconds, her heart racing slightly, unsure of how to proceed. She had made her point. She wasn't invisible, and she wasn't going to just let the situation slide. But the clerk didn't seem to fully understand the weight of what had happened. There was still a distance, still a sense that her presence wasn't fully recognized, not as a customer, not as a person. The woman could feel the tension simmering in the air. She took a deep breath and forced herself to stay calm. She had seen worse in her years with the FBI, but this was different. This wasn't a criminal to apprehend. This wasn't a suspect to interrogate. This was a human interaction, and it stung more than anything she'd experienced recently. She couldn't let it go. She couldn't pretend that everything was fine and brush it off. It wasn't fine. She made another attempt to speak, keeping her tone polite but firm. "I'm really looking for something specific. If you could just show me where the foundation is, I'll make my decision." The clerk glanced up again, but only for a moment before looking back to the other customer, who was still being helped on the opposite side of the store. This time, the clerk's glance wasn't just distracted. It was dismissive, almost as though she was intentionally avoiding eye contact. The woman's stomach turned. This wasn't just indifference anymore. It was clear that the clerk was actively choosing not to engage with her. For a brief moment, the woman felt something rise up in her chest. She felt an anger she hadn't anticipated. Anger that was directed not only at the clerk, but at the situation itself. This wasn't just poor customer service. This was something more insidious. This was about race. This was about her being treated as if she didn't deserve the same level of respect as the other customers around her. The more she stood there, the more her frustration grew. She tried to push it down, to remind herself that it wasn't the clerk's fault, but everything about the situation was wrong. She had asked for help, and she had been dismissed. She had been treated differently, and she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that it had everything to do with the color of her skin. Without thinking, she stepped forward, her voice rising just a little higher than before. "I don't think you understand. I need help. I'm asking for your assistance, and I'm not leaving until I get it." The clerk glanced up, her face faltering for a moment, as if she hadn't expected to be spoken to so directly. But instead of apologizing or offering assistance, she simply blinked. Then she turned her back, walking away without a word. It was as if the clerk was signaling to her, in that quiet, subtle way, that she didn't matter, that her request wasn't valid, that she wasn't worth the effort. The woman felt a sharp, almost physical ache in her chest. This wasn't just about makeup, or shampoo, or finding the right shade of foundation anymore. This was about being seen, and not being seen. It was about respect. And right now, she felt anything but respected. For a moment, she stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. She looked around the store at the other customers who were getting what they needed without a second thought. They were being treated kindly, welcomed with smiles, with help at every turn. But here she was, a woman trying to buy something as simple as makeup, and she was being ignored. Her thoughts raced. She thought about the way people treated her when they didn't know who she was, when they didn't know she was an FBI agent, when they saw her as just another woman walking into a store. Nothing special, just blending into the crowd. She had learned long ago that being a woman in a powerful position often came with its own challenges. But being a woman of color added another layer of difficulty. She had experienced this kind of treatment before, but it always stung. And now, as she stood there, helpless in this moment, she began to wonder how many other people, women like her, had been brushed off and ignored without the authority to fight back. How many others walked into stores, into spaces, only to be treated as though they didn't matter, as though their presence was an inconvenience. It was a thought that made her stomach turn. She didn't want to believe it, but she couldn't ignore it any longer. This wasn't an isolated incident. This wasn't a one-time mistake. The woman's fists clenched at her sides, and she knew she had to do something. She couldn't just walk away. She wasn't going to let this moment slip away unnoticed. She wasn't just another face in the crowd. She was more than that, and she wasn't going to let anyone forget it. Turning sharply, she headed toward the front of the store, where the manager's office was located. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The woman walked briskly toward the front of the store, each step firm, her thoughts racing. She wasn't angry, not yet, but she was frustrated, and that frustration was beginning to bubble up inside her, demanding an outlet. She had to confront this. She had to speak up. The store manager's office was tucked behind the checkout counters, just beyond a row of tall display stands. As she approached, she noticed a few employees huddled around, chatting idly. Their eyes darted toward her for a brief moment, then quickly looked away, as if they hadn't seen her. The woman's heart pounded in her chest. She didn't want to cause a scene, didn't want to escalate things, but it seemed that every moment she stayed quiet, the more she felt like she was surrendering to something unfair, something unjust. Her hand slid to her purse, and she pulled out her badge, shiny, cold, and unmistakable. For a moment she hesitated, wondering if pulling the badge out was a step too far. After all, she wasn't here as an FBI agent. She was here as a customer. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that this wasn't just about her. It was about what she represented, the authority she held, and the respect everyone deserved. She couldn't let herself be ignored, not when it was clear that the situation wasn't a coincidence. She approached the manager's desk, where a middle-aged man in a crisp shirt was reviewing some paperwork. He looked up, startled by her sudden presence. The woman didn't waste any time. "I need to speak with you," she said, her voice steady. "About the service I've received here today." The manager gave her a polite smile, but there was an edge of confusion in his expression. He must have assumed she was just another disgruntled customer. "Of course, ma'am. How can I help you?" She didn't say anything at first. Instead, she held the badge in her hand, where it was clearly visible. The logo of the FBI gleamed. In the fluorescent light, a sharp reminder of her role. The manager's eyes flicked to it immediately, his face paling. He blinked, and then there was an uncomfortable silence. "I've been here for over 20 minutes," the woman said, her tone now quieter, but no less firm. "I've asked for assistance twice, and both times I've been ignored. But when another customer comes along, the attention is immediate. I think you know exactly what I'm talking about." The manager's face turned an awkward shade of red. He stammered for a moment, fumbling with his words, as if trying to find the right thing to say. I'm so sorry, ma'am. I didn't realize you were having a problem. I assure you that's not our policy." He stood up quickly, almost knocking over his chair. "Let me see what I can do to fix this," he said, trying to regain his composure. But there was something off about his tone. It was too hurried, too nervous. The woman didn't move. She simply watched him, her gaze steady and unwavering. She could tell he was uncomfortable, clearly regretting the situation now that he realized who she was. But the truth was, she didn't feel any satisfaction from his reaction. It didn't make the discomfort go away. The manager rushed over to the cosmetics aisle, his footsteps quick and agitated. The woman stayed behind, not wanting to follow, just yet. She could hear him talking to the clerk in low, urgent tones. But from where she stood, it was clear that his words were empty. He wasn't addressing the real issue. He wasn't telling the clerk what needed to be said, that the way she had treated the woman was wrong. The woman's heart sank. This wasn't just about getting an apology from the store manager. It wasn't even about the clerk, who would likely brush this off as a simple misunderstanding. No, this was about something bigger, something much bigger than a simple customer service error. She watched the scene unfold from a distance, feeling an ache in her chest. She didn't feel powerful, standing there with her badge. She didn't feel victorious. Instead, she felt the deep sting of something that should never have been part of the equation in the first place. Disrespect. The manager returned shortly after, looking more flustered than before. He stood in front of her, shifting his weight nervously. "Once again, I apologize for the inconvenience, ma'am. We'll make sure this doesn't happen again. Please feel free to take whatever you need from the store." On the house, the offer hung in the air, but it didn't ease the woman's tension. She was being treated as a special case because of her badge, but that didn't fix the underlying issue. She didn't want to be given special treatment. She wanted fairness. She wanted to be treated like any other customer, without needing to prove that she was worthy of respect. "I don't need free items," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I need respect, and you should make sure everyone in this store gets the same level of respect, no matter who they are or where they come from." For a moment, the manager simply stood there, his mouth hanging open slightly, clearly unsure of how to respond. But the woman didn't wait for an answer. She turned on her heel, walking toward the exit with a sense of finality in her stride. She didn't have to say another word. The message had been made clear. As she stepped out into the warmth of the afternoon, she felt a weight lift off her shoulders. It wasn't the satisfaction of a victory, because this wasn't a win, but she had done something that mattered. She had made a stand, and that, at least, gave her a quiet sense of peace. The woman walked out of the store, the sound of the door's bell chiming softly behind her. She hadn't expected the situation to play out the way it had, but as she stepped into the harsh sunlight, she realized the weight of it all. She had done what she felt was necessary, and yet, something about the experience lingered in her mind. The manager's nervous apology, the clerk's dismissive attitude. It didn't feel like enough. She didn't feel a sense of closure or resolution. Instead, there was a quiet discomfort that followed her, like a shadow she couldn't shake. As she walked toward her car, she thought about what had just happened, replaying each moment in her mind. She had done what she needed to do, but did it really change anything? She wasn't sure. In her years with the FBI, she had learned to face dangerous situations, to remain calm in the face of stress and fear, and to take charge when the moment called for it. But this wasn't a case to crack or a criminal to catch. This was a subtle, insidious form of disrespect. It wasn't something she could simply investigate or solve with a few well-chosen words. The feeling of being judged and ignored, based on her appearance, her race, was something that stayed with her long after the encounter was over. She leaned against her car, the heat of the afternoon sun pressing against her skin, and let out a long, slow breath. She had been so focused on the injustice in that store, so driven by the need to make things right in the moment, that she hadn't fully thought about the bigger picture. The clerk's behavior wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern, a reflection of the subtle racism that many people faced every day, in places like stores, workplaces, and schools. The woman felt a deep sadness at that realization. As an FBI agent, she had seen racism in its ugliest forms, in the most violent and explicit ways. But this was different. This was quiet, hidden under the surface, in ways that couldn't easily be called out or challenged. It made her wonder how many other people, countless others, experienced the same thing. People who didn't have the same authority to confront it, who didn't carry badges that could demand attention. Her thoughts drifted to the countless cases she had worked on, the investigations that had demanded her full attention. She had worked so hard to make a difference, to bring justice to those who had been wronged. But in moments like this, she felt small, as if there was no way to truly fix the quiet injustices that were buried deep within society. She clenched her hands into fists, a wave of frustration and helplessness rising within her. Was this something she would just have to accept? That despite all the work she did, despite her dedication to fighting for justice, there were still invisible barriers, still hidden biases that no amount of power or authority could erase. The thought gnawed at her. She wasn't sure what the answer was, or how to fight something that didn't have a clear target. But she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to let moments like this slide. Not when she could help it. She wasn't going to let the quiet weight of prejudice take root, even if it meant facing discomfort and difficult conversations. The woman stood up straight, shaking off the lingering doubts. She had done what she could today, and though it hadn't brought her the peace she expected, it had brought her clarity. The fight wasn't over. It wasn't over for her, and it wasn't over for anyone who had been treated unfairly, simply because of how they looked. As she drove away, she couldn't help but think of the other woman she had seen in the store, the one who had been treated poorly by another employee. She hadn't been able to stand by and ignore it. If anything, it reminded her that every small action, every word mattered. If she could help even one person, it was worth it. And she knew she would keep standing up, no matter how hard it was. She had a lot of work ahead of her, but now she had a new sense of purpose. It wasn't just about the badge or the power she held in her career. It was about something deeper, something that couldn't be fixed by any authority. but could be fought by showing up, speaking out, and never backing down. The woman drove, in silence, her hands gripping the steering wheel, as the hum of the engine filled the quiet of the car. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, casting a soft golden hue over everything. But she hardly noticed. Her mind was still back, at the store, replaying the conversation with the manager and the strange, cold behavior of the clerk. She couldn't let go of the feeling that something had been left unresolved. She pulled into her driveway, her tires crunching over the gravel, and turned off the engine. The weight of the day still clung to her like a second skin. As she got out of the car, she glanced over at the neighbor's house, seeing a few kids running through the yard, laughing and playing. The ordinary scene stood in stark contrast to the storm of thoughts swirling in her head. She entered her house and kicked off her shoes, heading straight for the kitchen. The familiar scent of coffee lingered in the air, and she stood there for a moment, staring at the half-full cup on the counter. It was warm, but it had long lost its steam, much like her own sense of urgency. Her phone buzzed on the counter, and she picked it up absent-mindedly. A text from a fellow agent popped up on the screen. It was an update about a case she was working on, a small relief in the sea of frustration she felt. She quickly typed back a response, setting the phone down and letting out a sigh. There was so much she could focus on, so many tasks, so many people to protect, but for some reason, today's experience lingered like a weight she couldn't shake off. She leaned back against the kitchen counter, eyes closing for a moment, and let her mind wander again to the clerk's face. The way her eyes had avoided meeting hers, the dismissive attitude that had dripped from every action. It wasn't just about the makeup, the inconvenience, or the poor service. It was about something much deeper, something that had been quietly woven into the fabric of society, the subtle ways in which people were made to feel less than, invisible, just because of the way they looked, the color of their skin, or the assumptions others made about them. She had been on the other side of those assumptions for her whole life, but this was different. She had expected something else, maybe a little more awareness, maybe a little more decency, but no matter how hard she thought about it, she couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of powerlessness. As an agent of the law, as someone who had spent years fighting for justice, she was used to standing up to visible threats, criminals, predators, dangerous individuals. But this was a quiet battle, one that didn't have a clear enemy. It was rooted in the fabric of everyday life, and the people who perpetuated it often didn't even realize the harm they were causing. She picked up her phone again and opened up a browser, typing in a few words that had been running through her mind all day. How to combat microaggressions. The search results were full of articles, studies, and blog posts, some written by people who had experienced similar moments of subtle exclusion, others offering advice on how to navigate situations just like the one she had faced in the store. As she skimmed through the articles, one thing stood out. People often underestimated the power of these small, seemingly insignificant moments. They weren't just annoyances. They added up. They chipped away at people's sense of belonging, at their worth, and over time, they built walls that kept others out. She hadn't thought about it like that before. To her, microaggressions had always seemed like small, manageable problems, things to be addressed quickly, like dusting off a coat of dirt. But now, in the quiet of her kitchen, she understood just how much those small moments could weigh on someone. The realization hit her hard. She had always been focused on the big picture, on chasing down criminals and uncovering major wrongdoings. But what if the real fight started with these small moments, these hidden acts of prejudice? What if it was in these moments that change could actually begin? The woman put her phone down, a new sense of clarity settling over her. It wouldn't be easy. The battle was far from over. But now, she knew that she wasn't just fighting to catch criminals. She was fighting to change something much deeper, something that lived in the hearts and minds of people every day. She couldn't solve this problem in one day, but she could start by speaking up when it mattered. She took a deep breath, allowing the weight of the day to shift into something more constructive. Tomorrow, she would continue her work in the FBI, tracking down criminals, solving cases, and keeping people safe. But today, she had learned something important, and maybe, just maybe, that lesson would help her make a difference in the world. Beyond the walls of the office, she smiled faintly as she grabbed her cup of coffee and took a sip. There was still a long road ahead, but she was ready to walk it. The next day, the woman returned to work, her mind still heavy with thoughts of the previous day's experience. She tried to focus on the cases at hand, papers to review, files to organize, people to interview. But every now and then, her thoughts would drift back to the store. It wasn't just the bad service that bothered her anymore, but the bigger question it had raised. How many others were experiencing the same thing, feeling the same way? How many times had this happened to people who didn't have a badge to flash, or a voice that could demand to be heard? As the day wore on, the woman found herself in the break room, sipping on a cup of coffee, when one of her colleagues walked in. His name was James, a senior agent she'd worked with for several years. He was someone she could count on, someone who always had her back. They'd shared cases, long hours, and even more intense moments during some of their biggest investigations. But today, the casual conversation was different. She could tell something was on her mind, and he noticed it too. "Hey, you okay?" James asked, his voice light but laced with concern. "You seem off today." She hesitated for a moment, unsure if she should share what had happened. She wasn't one to often talk about personal matters, especially when it involved something as frustrating as the experience in the store. But something in the way James asked made her feel like it might help to say it out loud. "I had a weird experience yesterday," she began, leaning back in her chair. "I went to a store to grab some things, and the clerk, well, she ignored me. She didn't even make eye contact. And when another customer came in, she immediately helped them. It wasn't just poor service. It felt personal, like she saw me differently because of how I looked." James raised an eyebrow, clearly processing what she had said. "That's messed up. Did you say anything to her?" The woman nodded. "I tried, but it didn't make much of a difference. I ended up talking to the manager, but it didn't feel like enough. I wanted to say more, do more, but I don't know if it would have changed anything." James looked at her thoughtfully. "You know, I've been thinking about stuff like this more lately too. I don't think it's something we talk about enough. Like, racism isn't always in your face, right? A lot of the time, it's in those small everyday moments where people don't even realize what they're doing. And it adds up. It's a constant thing for people of color." The woman sighed, relieved to hear James speak so openly about it. She had always known he was a good guy, but hearing him recognize the truth of what she had gone through made a difference. "Exactly," she said. "And it's exhausting. You don't want to feel like you have to fight these small battles all the time. But if you don't, it just becomes the norm. And that's even worse." James gave a small nod. "It's something we all have to be aware of, and we need to make it known when we see it happening, even if it's uncomfortable. Maybe that's the change we need. People just speaking up, even if it's just in small ways." The woman thought about his words, feeling a little lighter. "I think you're right. Maybe it's time to stop letting these moments slide. Not just for myself, But for everyone who doesn't feel like they have the power to call it out, there was a brief silence as the weight of their conversation hung in the air, but it wasn't heavy in the way it had been before. Now, there was a sense of solidarity, of knowing that speaking out, even when it felt like the world didn't want to listen, could make a difference. "Thanks for listening," she said, offering him a small smile. "I needed to say it out loud." "No problem," James replied with a grin. "We've got each other's backs. Always." As she sat there, sipping her coffee, she realized something she hadn't fully acknowledged before. She wasn't alone in this fight. She had colleagues, friends, and allies who would stand beside her. It was going to be a long, difficult road, but at least now, she knew that there were people who understood, who were willing to speak out too. With a renewed sense of resolve, she stood up, ready to face whatever came next, both in her work as an FBI agent and in the quieter battles she would continue to fight, one small moment at a time. If this story resonated with you, don't stay silent. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's keep this conversation going. If you believe in the power of standing up for what's right, hit the like button and share this story with others. And if you want to see more stories that dive deep into real issues and meaningful change, be sure to subscribe for future updates. Every voice matters.